Emma and Tyler had always been adventurers. When Tyler suggested a 3-day backpacking trip in the remote Pine Hollow wilderness, Emma didn't hesitate. They'd been on countless hikes before, but this time felt special. No cell service, no distractions, just the two of them and nature. The trailhead was eerily empty when they arrived. Tyler joked about it. "Guess we have the whole place to ourselves." Emma laughed, but something about the silence unsettled her. She brushed it off as pre-trip jitters. The first day was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Birds sang and the couple chatted as they made their way to the first campsite. By nightfall, they were settled by a small stream with the crackling fire keeping the forest at bay. But as they lay in the tent that night, Emma thought she heard something, a faint whistle like someone calling out. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Tyler stirred half asleep. "It's the wind. Go back to sleep." Emma wasn't so sure. The next morning, Emma was still thinking about the sound, but Tyler was eager to press on. They packed up and started hiking deeper into the wilderness as the trail grew narrower. Around midday, they came across something strange, a single hiking boot lying in the middle of the path. Tyler picked it up. "Weird. Who hikes with one shoe?" Emma didn't laugh this time. "What if they're hurt? Maybe we should turn back." Tyler waved it off. "It's probably been here for years." Emma reluctantly followed, but she couldn't stop the feeling of unease. By evening, the woods felt a lot quieter. Even Tyler seemed on edge. They set up camp near a cluster of boulders, but the silence felt suffocating. That night, Emma woke up to the sound of footsteps circling outside the tent. She shook Tyler awake. Her heart was racing. "Someone's out there!" He grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining it into the darkness. Nothing. "Probably an animal," he said, though his voice was less confident. Emma didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, they both looked exhausted. "Let's just get to the overlook and head back," Tyler said. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder, sure she'd see someone or something following them. Around noon, they reached a clearing. At first, it looked like a campsite, but as they got closer, they realized it wasn't. A circle of stones sat in the middle, charred black from fire. But what surrounded it was worse. Dozens of small, crude figures made of sticks and twine hanging from the trees. "Tyler!" Emma's voice cracked. "Let's go," he said, grabbing her hand. But as they turned, they saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, gaunt, and wrapped in filthy clothes. Its face was hidden beneath a mask of bark and twigs. The couple froze. "Hey!" Tyler shouted, his voice trembling. "We're just passing through." The figure didn't move. "Let's go," Emma whispered, pulling Tyler. They walked quickly, not daring to look back, but the feeling of being watched never left. By the time they set up camp that night, Emma was ready to leave everything behind. "Let's just hike back in the dark. I can't stay out here." Tyler shook his head. "We'll get lost. Just a few hours of sleep and we'll head out first thing." But Emma couldn't sleep. Around midnight, she heard it again. The footsteps. This time they weren't circling. They were approaching. "Tyler," she said, shaking him awake. Before he could respond, a low whistle echoed through the woods. It was the same sound she'd heard the first night. Tyler grabbed his knife and flashlight. "Stay here." "No!" Emma grabbed his arm. She had tears in her eyes, but it was too late. Something slammed into the tent, knocking them both backward. The flashlight rolled across the ground, its beam flickering wildly. Emma screamed as the tent collapsed. Tyler yelled, swinging his knife blindly, but Emma saw him get dragged into the darkness. His scream was cut short. She ran. She didn't think. She just ran barefoot and bleeding, crashing through the forest. The whistle followed her as she ran. By dawn, Emma stumbled onto the road near the trailhead, barely able to stand. A passing car stopped and the driver called for help. When the rangers searched the area, they found their campsite destroyed and Tyler's backpack torn to shreds. But they never found Tyler. All they found were the stick figures now hanging from the trees near the trailhead. Emma told the police everything: the stick figures, the masked figure, and how Tyler was dragged into the darkness. Search teams combed the area for weeks, but they never found him. To this day, the case remains open, and the search for Tyler continues. But sometimes late at night, Emma hears a faint whistle in the distance, and she knows deep down that the woods haven't forgotten her. It started as a typical hike. Matt had taken the day off to clear his mind. He was heading to Ridge Trail, which is a remote but scenic path tucked deep in the mountains. The trail wasn't officially marked, but local hikers swore by its beauty. That was part of the appeal. No crowds or noise, just the wilderness and the occasional birdsong. Matt parked his car at the dirt lot. He noticed that his car was the only one parked there, which was a good sign as he wanted some peace and quiet. Slinging his backpack over his shoulder, he locked the car and set off into the woods. The first few miles were uneventful. The air was crisp and the trail wound through towering pines that seemed to swallow the world. Matt breathed deeply, letting the stress of his 9-to-5 life melt away. But as the sun climbed higher, Matt felt a weird feeling in his gut, telling him something wasn't right about this trail. It wasn't anything obvious, so he shrugged it off as paranoia. "You're alone, idiot," he told himself. "There's no one else here." Still, he couldn't shake the unease. Around mile 4, he stopped for water, crouching on a rock, to take in the view of the valley below. That's when he noticed them, a group of 5 people standing about 50 yards away, just off the trail. They were too far for details, but something about them didn't feel right. They weren't hiking. They had no gear and no backpacks, just standing there, staring in his direction. Matt raised a hand in an awkward wave, trying to be friendly. No response. They didn't wave back, didn't move, didn't say anything. Just stood there like statues. A chill ran up his spine. He capped his water bottle, trying to act casual as he continued up the trail. When he glanced over his shoulder, the group was gone. The next hour was tense. The woods felt darker somehow. Every rustle of leaves made Matt's heart jump. He kept looking over his shoulder, but the trail behind him remained empty. By mile 6, he convinced himself he'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe they were other hikers who'd turned back. Then he heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth behind him. Matt froze. His breath caught in his chest. He didn't dare turn around at first, hoping whoever it was would pass. But the footsteps stopped as he stopped. He waited, straining his ears, but there was nothing. Then slowly he glanced over his shoulder, but again there was no one there. He exhaled shakily and pressed on, walking faster now. The trail narrowed, hugging the edge of a steep drop-off. Maybe it was an animal, or his imagination again. He tried to think logically, but logic didn't explain the growing sense of dread gnawing at his gut. The sun was beginning to dip when he saw them again. The same 5 people now standing in the middle of the trail about 20 feet ahead. This time he could see them more clearly. They were dressed in plain, nondescript clothes, jeans, hoodies, jackets. Their faces were expressionless, and their eyes were locked on him. Matt stopped cold. His mouth went dry. Hey, he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Everything okay?" No answer. They just stood there, blocking the path. Matt's instincts screamed at him to run. But where? The trail behind him led nowhere, but miles of forest, and ahead was the people standing there. He clenched his fist, taking a cautious step forward. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said. "I'm just hiking." Still no response. But then one of them, a tall man with a shaved head, tilted his head slightly, like a predator sizing up prey. It was such a small, subtle movement, but it sent a bolt of terror through Matt. Then they stepped forward, one by one, moving in unison. Matt bolted. He didn't think, he just ran. His heart was pounding, and his lungs were burning. The trail blurred beneath his feet as branches tore at his clothes and face. Behind him, the sound of footsteps erupted, multiple sets closing the gap fast. He veered off the trail, hoping the thick forest would slow them down. But the woods seemed alive with movement, branches snapping, leaves crunching, shadows darting in his peripheral vision. No matter how fast he ran, the footsteps never faded. Panic consumed him. He stumbled over roots and rocks as he ran. He couldn't hear anything but the pounding of his heart and the relentless pursuit behind him. Finally, he spotted a rocky outcrop jutting out of the hillside, a shallow cave just big enough to crawl into. In complete desperation, he scrambled inside, pressing himself against the cold stone. He clamped a hand over his mouth, trying to muffle his ragged breathing. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. Matt's heart hammered as he heard voices. "We know you're here," a man's voice called out, calm and deliberate. "You can't hide forever." Matt's stomach dropped. His mind raced. Why? Why me? He didn't move, didn't breathe. The voices grew quieter, then faded entirely. He stayed in the cave for what felt like hours, too scared to move. When the sun finally set, he mustered the courage to crawl out. The woods were silent now, but the trail back to his car felt impossibly long. Every noise made him jump. When he finally reached the parking lot, his car was the only one there, just as he'd left it. Matt didn't look back as he sped down the mountain road. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore, that somewhere out there in the dark, they were still watching. It was supposed to be an easy day hike, just a few hours on the Alaskan Trail. The weather was perfect, and neither Jack nor Lily had ever hiked this trail before, so they were excited. They packed light, some snacks, water, and their phones. Then they set off in the morning. At first, everything was great. The trail was beautiful, lined with tall trees and the sound of birds in the air. They stopped for a quick break after an hour sitting on a big rock to rest. But after a while, things started to feel weird. It got really quiet. The usual sounds, the birds, the rustling of leaves, just stopped. "This is kind of creepy, right?" Lily asked, looking around. Jack didn't seem too bothered. "It's fine. It's just early. We'll be at the top in no time." They kept walking, but it wasn't the same. The path was narrower now, twisting and turning in odd ways. It didn't feel like the same trail they had started on. About 2 hours into the hike, they saw him, a guy walking toward them on the trail. He was dressed in dark clothes and his face was hidden under a big hat. He didn't say anything as he passed them, just walked by with his head down. "That was weird," Lily said, watching him disappear into the trees. Jack frowned. "Yeah, kinda." He didn't even say hi or anything. They shook it off and kept walking. But now Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every now and then, she'd hear footsteps behind them, but when she looked, no one was there. Finally, they made it to the summit. The view was amazing, but something about the vibe felt off. Jack pulled out his phone to take a picture, but when he checked the battery, it was dead. "Mine's dead too," Lily said, looking at her phone. "That's weird. I had it charged before we left," Jack muttered. The summit was empty now, just the two of them. "Let's just sit for a bit and rest," Lily suggested. "We'll head back soon." They sat in silence, but the feeling of being watched kept growing. Lily kept glancing around, and then from behind them she heard something. Crunching leaves like someone was walking toward them. She turned around fast. It was the man. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, still with his face hidden, just staring at them. "Jack," Lily said, her voice shaky. "Who is that?" Jack got up, squinting at the man. "Hey, are you okay?" The man didn't say anything, didn't move. He just kept watching them. "We need to go," Lily said, grabbing Jack's arm. "Now." Jack wasn't listening. "I'm just going to ask him what he's doing up here." Lily's stomach dropped. The man's head tilted in a strange way, almost like he wasn't human. Then he spoke, his voice low and strange, like it came from far away. "You shouldn't be here." Jack didn't move. "What do you mean? We're just hiking." "You shouldn't be here," the man repeated, his voice colder now. The man started walking toward them, slowly but with purpose. Lily's heart raced. "Jack, we need to leave. Now!" But Jack didn't listen. "What's his deal? I'm going to figure out what's going on." The man came closer. Lily noticed something dark on his clothes, stains like old blood. She grabbed Jack's arm and pulled him back. "We need to run now." They didn't hesitate. They ran down the trail as fast as they could, hearing the man's footsteps behind them, getting closer and closer. When they finally reached the parking lot, they didn't look back. They jumped into the car and drove off, their hearts pounding. As they drove further away, Lily looked in the rearview mirror. She saw something, a shadow standing just at the edge of the trees, watching them. Maggie and Tom had been talking about this hike for months, a weekend getaway to the peaceful Pine Ridge Trail, a trail known for its breathtaking views and quiet woods. They planned to hike for a few hours, then camp overnight, and head home the next day. Simple, relaxing. The first few hours went perfectly. The weather was clear, the air fresh, and the scenery just as beautiful as they'd imagined. They stopped by a small stream to take a break. dipping their toes in the cool water and enjoying the quiet. "I love this," Maggie said, leaning back against a tree. "We should do this more often." Tom smiled, taking a swig from his water bottle. "Yeah, this is nice. Just us, the woods, no distractions." They continued on the trail, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the breeze in the trees. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the feeling of peace started to shift. It was subtle at first, an odd quiet, a sense that they weren't as alone as they'd thought. "I swear, I thought I heard someone behind us," Maggie said, glancing over her shoulder. Tom looked around. "There's no one. You're just spooked." But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling. Every now and then, she thought she heard footsteps trailing them, but when she turned around, no one was there. They pressed on, hoping it was just their imagination. But by the time they reached the campsite, a small clearing by the edge of a cliff, it was clear something was off. The tent was already set up. Not just any tent, but one of those large camping tents, the kind meant for families. The kind that shouldn't be anywhere near a secluded trail like this. "What the hell?" Tom said, his voice low. "Who set this up?" Maggie took a step back, her gut telling her something wasn't right. "This isn't our tent. This wasn't here when we passed through earlier." They looked around the clearing. No sign of anyone. No car, no equipment, no campfire. Just the tent, sitting there like it had always been. "Maybe someone else is camping here," Tom suggested, though his voice was shaky. "Maybe they set up earlier." But Maggie wasn't convinced. She noticed that the tent's zipper was slightly open, as though someone had just been in there and left in a hurry. "I don't like this," Maggie said, stepping away. "Let's just keep walking. We can camp somewhere else." But Tom was already walking toward the tent, curiosity getting the better of him. "Hold on, let me just check it out. It's probably nothing." Before Maggie could protest, Tom ducked inside. He didn't even call out or make a sound, just disappeared. "Maggie?" Tom's voice came from inside the tent, low and strained. "You need to come here." She felt her heart skip a beat. "Tom? What is it?" There was no response. "Tom?" Maggie called again, taking a few hesitant steps forward. The forest felt suffocating now, the trees pressing in around her. She could hear the sound of branches cracking in the distance, but everything felt wrong. She stepped closer to the tent. It was quiet. Too quiet. Then from inside, a voice. Tom's voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't quite his voice. "Maggie, come inside, it's safe." The voice sounded wrong, almost like a distorted version of Tom's, and it sent a chill down her spine. She stepped back, her mind racing. She turned and ran. She didn't know where, she didn't know why, but something told her that staying was the last thing she should do. She ran as fast as she could, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back, but the sound of footsteps, faint at first, then growing louder, followed her. She felt it, the presence behind her, closing in. Minutes later, she stumbled back onto the main trail. She didn't stop running until she reached the car, gasping for breath, eyes wild. When she finally dared to look back, the forest was still. The trail was empty. There was no sign of Tom, no sign of anyone. Maggie drove straight home, not daring to stop. She spoke to the police the next day, but when they sent out a search party, they found nothing. No sign of Tom, no camp, no tent. It was like they had never been there at all. But sometimes when Maggie's alone in her room, she swears she hears a faint voice on the wind. Tom's voice calling her name from deep in the woods.